Hello and welcome to Dice and Demons. I'm Emma, and in this video I'm going to show you how I paint my Kroxigors for my Lollipop Lizard Seraphon army for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So I start off with a model that's been primed using the White Scars primer, and then I paint it basically all over with one of the contrast paints, and this one is called Achillean Green, so it's a nice quite saturated turquoise color. And I use this as the underpainting or the base coat for my next steps. And the reason I'm doing this is just to get a little bit more depth and a little bit more visual interest to the piece, because this is something I'm painting, as I said, for an army. This is not something I'm painting for a display or for a competition or anything. So if you think you could do that a little bit better or make some of the blends a little bit more smooth, you're absolutely right, I could. But this is a level I'm perfectly happy with on the tabletop, and I don't want to spend 30 hours painting 3 models for the tabletop. So yeah, I'm going to be cutting some corners wherever I can, while at the same time trying to get to a level of painting that I'm also happy with. Then when the Achillean Green is all dry, I just hit it with a little bit of dry brushing using a makeup brush, because a makeup brush is much cheaper than official dry brushes, and it works just as well, if not better. This is the style of painting you might also know as slap chop, where you have a darker color underneath, then you do some sort of zenithal highlighting. You can do that with spray cans, you can do it with an airbrush, and you can also just do it as I do it here with dry brushing. Then I use another contrast paint, and this one is called Athematic Blue, which is again a turquoise color like the Achillean Green. This is just much lighter in shade. I use this for the skin color on all of my lizards for my Lollipop Lizards, so of course the Kroxigors had to have that as well. Then for the scales I use another contrast paint, and this one is called Talazar Blue, and it's just a really nice, blue color, and I think it works well with the Athematic Blue, because it's still within sort of the same type of tone, like bluish tones, but it is still different enough to give you a little bit of variety from the skin versus the scales. I also do here, as you can see, a quick wet blend where I blend the Talazar Blue with a little bit of Athematic Blue to make sure I have a nice transition between the skin and the scales. Next up, I start working on the scales on the back, and I want them to look different to those of the rest of the model. And first up, I am using a green color called Warp Lightning. All of the colors I'm using here are contrast paints. Next up, I use a Yanden yellow in the middle. And then lastly, I use a red contrast paint, which is called Blood Angels Red. And as you can see, I'm trying to work fairly quickly because I am wet blending all these 3 colors into each other. And it doesn't have to be perfect at this stage at all, both because, it's, as I said, it's for tabletop, but also because I'm going to be covering all of this with highlights later on. Then for the weapons, I wanted them to look a little bit magical, and so I decided to paint them purple. First off, they had the same Achillean Green dry brushed with a bit of white as the rest of the models, and then I painted it with a contrast paint called Luxion Purple, which is sort of a nice mid-tone purple color. It looks a little bit more blue here on camera, but in real life it's just a really nice purple. I then want to start working on highlighting the skin, and for that I'm using basically 3 colors, the aquamarine from Vallejo and the Achillean Green contrast paint, and then a bit of white to make the lighter tones. So these are the 3 colors I'm using when I'm working on the skin. So I just first start with the aquamarine on its own, just painting in all of the skin, and I use it watered down a little bit so it won't obscure all the details I got from the slap chop base colors. And I just want it to look fairly nice and fairly smooth, but again, this is for a tabletop, it's not for display, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I then start working on the highlights, where I use just progressively lighter tones, and I try to make sure that I put most of the highlights where I think it would make sense for the light to hit the model from above, but it's not something that I'm spending ages trying to figure out. I just more or less put it where I think it will look nice, to be honest. And when I was happy with the first couple of layers of highlight, I started, instead of trying to apply it like a really smooth blend, because one, I suck at it, two, I don't really enjoy it, and three, it would take a lot longer than I was willing to spend. I then placed the highlights just with thin, not diagonal lines, but lines that sort of fit the way the sort of the curvature of the muscles, because I think it does the job well enough of establishing highlights, and it makes it look just a little bit more stylized, and then you don't really expect the highlights to be all that smooth. So I think that's a nice way of cheating your way out of doing something that you don't want to spend ages on. For the last layer of highlights, I mixed a little bit of white with Starfire Yellow, which is a fluorescent yellow paint from Huge Miniatures. And it doesn't really show up here on the camera. It looks like it's just white, but it just has a slight tint of really cold yellow to it, which I think works very nice as a highlight for blue. It's a trick I picked up from Vince Venturella. He does that a lot when he's highlighting blue skin, for instance, and it's just it was a really good idea, I think. While I liked the highlights that I had done, I thought the whole thing looked just a little bit too pale and had a little bit too little contrast. So I used a bit of the Achillean green to add some shadows and some definition to the muscles. Again, this could be done much more smoothly, and you can spend much more time on it. But for something like this, I think just a thin down layer of a contrast paint works really well, just to add a little bit of saturation and a little bit of contrast. Next up, I started working on highlighting the blue scales, and for the first layer I used a color called Blaster Blue, which is a fluorescent color from Huge Miniatures, and it's both a nice light blue color, but it also has the added benefit of, well, being fluorescent, so it means it glows under UV light, which is absolutely not necessary, but I think it's kind of fun. So if I can, I will include fluorescent paints sort of almost everywhere in every step of my painting process. For the final layer of highlights on the blue scales, I mix in a bit of white with the Blaster Blue, and then I try to touch the top of each scale with that to give a sort of illusion of light and shadow. I know it's very simplified, and you could definitely do this with much more finesse and many more steps in between these two. But for tabletop, I think this is completely fine. It's definitely at a level where I am going to be happy to use them in my games. And now comes the part that I've looked forward to most, highlighting the scales in the back. And here you can see the different colors I'm using. I'll talk you through them as we're painting. I just wanted you to see how many colors there were and what they looked like next to each other on the wet palette. So first off, I am highlighting the green scales, and the first layer of color I'm using is Mood Green, which is a paint from Citadel, and it's just a really nice vibrant green color that I like to use as a highlight for the Warp Lightning. I think they just work really well together. Again, as you can see here, I'm not trying to do really smooth blends or anything. I just use thin vertical strokes because I think it fits both with the overall aesthetic of the army I'm going for, but I also think it works well with the texture that is already sculpted on the models. Then for the yellow, I'm using Flash Gauge Yellow, another color from Citadel, which it's just a sort of nice standard yellow color. And then I move on to my orange color, and this one is a color from Vallejo called Lava Orange. I try not to use fluorescent colors for the first layer of highlights, just to make sure that I can have somewhere I can move up from, and not just such a bright baseline that I can't really actually highlight it much. The red color I'm using here is Mephiston Red, which is also a color from Citadel. I try to make sure not to paint over all of the shadows that were left behind by the Achillean green slap chop thing, because I think it adds some nice contrast and a little bit of visual interest that you wouldn't get if I had just painted these scales without any darker underpainting first. Then for the next level of highlights for the green, I am using a color called Gamma Green, which is also from Huge Miniatures, and it's one of their fluorescent paints. So now I'm starting to paint with the fluorescent paints. And I have to admit that this is probably the part of the painting process that I enjoy the most. I just think this is just somehow great fun to me. Highlighting with very bright colors and painting in some sort of texture and not trying to make really smooth blends. For the yellow highlight here, I'm using Starfire Yellow, again from Huge Miniatures, and it was the same color I used mixed up with a lot of white paint to highlight the blue skin on the front of the model. The red color you can see me using here is called Radar Red, and it's also from Huge Miniatures. And I try not to paint over all of the first layer of highlights because I want the brightest highlights to be towards the tip of the scales, both because I think it would make sense, sort of that's probably where you would have more light hitting the model, but also just to create something that looks a little bit like you have some depth and some shadows. Then for the orange, I am using another color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Laser Orange, and it doesn't show up very well on camera for some reason. The fluorescent orange looks great in real life, but not when you are filming it. Then for the last layer of highlights on the green, I am using another color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Quantum Green. And it's just a really nice, vibrant green color. It has a sort of yellowish tint to it that I think works really well on stuff like this. I then go over the scales a little bit back and forth with some of the paints where I think I need a little bit more highlights to add a little bit more definition, and I just I spend a little bit more time on this step than on any of the other steps, just because this is the thing I find the most enjoyable and where I think it makes the most difference if you are willing to put in the time. I decided that I really wanted his face to pop, and I know of no other color that pops as well as pink does, so of course I had to use pink for highlighting. The two colors I'm using here are both from Huge Miniatures, and the first one is called Pulse Wave Pink, and it may look a little bit odd to highlight blue with pink, but I think it gives it a sort of very fantasy magical tone, which I really like. And again, this is for a tabletop, so I thought, yeah, it's okay. It doesn't look very smooth. It actually looks perhaps slightly jarring with the almost contrasting colors like this, but I think it gives a nice sort of look. Any of my other Lollipop Lizard Saurus warriors and stuff, they don't have pink faces, they just have blue faces, but I thought these are sort of more elite warriors, so a pink face was perfectly fine for them. And the next layer here is done with the Cyber Pink, also from Huge Miniatures, and again, I try to vaguely give the illusion of light and shadow by hitting the tip of the scales and then the top of his sort of facial features. But I'm not spending too much time on this. It's just actually more or less where I think it will just look nice. To tie in the weapons with the rest of the model, I decided to highlight that with the same two pink colors as I used on the face. I was considering highlighting them with purple because that would make sense since I just base coated them purple. But I thought, if you have a chance to include a little bit more pink, well, why not do it? And it will still look a little bit different from the face because the face has a base coat that's blue and this has a base coat that's purple, so it won't be exactly the same, but it'll still match quite nicely, I think. And then I just highlight it again with the Cyber Pink that I also used for the final highlight on the face. And I don't spend too much time, as you can see here, working out where I want the highlights to be. I just sort of wing it and put in some highlights that I think will look decent. And here you can see the final result. I'm really happy with this guy. I'm actually happy with all three of them. I batch painted the 3 Kroxigors so that I would have a fully painted unit that I could use for both games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar and also Spearhead. And I have a fully painted Spearhead ready to go, which is awesome. And I'm so looking forward to trying it out with the Seraphon. I think they look quite well on their own, but I also think they will match the look of my Saurus warriors, as you can see here. So the colors are more or less the same. It's just the Kroxigors are just a little bit more vibrant on their scales in the back and on their faces. And of course, since I painted them with fluorescent paints, they will glow under UV light, as you can see here. And I have yet to actually find a place where I can play a game under a fluorescent light. But I mean, at some point, I hope it will happen, because it could just be fun. So I hope you like them. And before you leave, I would just like to take the opportunity to thank the wonderful people who support Dice and Demons over on Patreon. So thank you so much to Thomas Madsen, Gwenna L, Jordan Hollands, Queen's Wolf, Double J's Terrain, Mola, Steve Eberly, Nassim Makaya, Andrew Correa, Anthony Polcastro, Bosworth the Rogue, Mando Project, Starcon85, S. Bear, Economicus, Elliot Philby, Dr. Tom Zimbardo, Cyberfossil, Cinnamon Coffee 87, Terranery, Josh Van Anja Pavelzik, Charlie Robertson, and VT Knight 007. I'll leave a link to the Patreon down in the show notes if you would also like to support Dice and Demons. If you want to stay up to date on my painting projects, you can do so over on X, formerly known as Twitter, and on Instagram, both places you'll find me as Dice and Demons. So if you have any sort of questions or comments or suggestions for future painting projects you would like to see here on this channel, please let me know in the comment section and I'll do my very best to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!